so God was moving in my life, and this pendulum, swing toward enthusiasm and love of Scripture and Torah is an awesome ride. And then I kept reading and kept learning and got exposed to some other thoughts, and I learned more about the paganism that had, worked its way into our interpretation of Scripture. And I began to have doubts, and I was struggling. And I went back to Scripture. I thought, but we've got those 300 prophecies about Messiah that, Jesus fulfilled. And boy, if only 48 of them were true, that'd be 10 to the 157th power. That's statistically, absolutely impossible that happened by chance. And I started reading those, and it was awesome. And I loved reading those little prophecies. And then I made a mistake, and I actually went back and read the first 2/3 of the book. And I realized
the Old Testament or the Tanakh.
Meaning the Tanakh. Okay. And I realized, oh my goodness, these New Testament prophecies that I've always been told are so clear and so amazing and irrefutable are a little fuzzy. And I realized sometimes they're not actually quite prophecies, or sometimes they didn't really seem to be talking, at least initially, about anything to do with Messiah. And I began to feel like my Christianity was built on a house of cards, and I went to Rabbi Google and I read all sorts of things.
Now, this is before you met me, right?
This is before I met you, yes.
Okay.
And, Rabbi Google told me that none of this stuff was legitimate, and none of these were talking about the Messiah, and it was all just a sham. So one night at dinner, we were talking about how if you really understand both sides of a topic, you could argue for your belief or you could argue against it, because hopefully you realize the other side aren't complete idiots. There are actually reasons why they believe what they believe. Mm-hmm. And if you've truly dealt with those beliefs, you could argue their side if you had to. So I said, Nehemia, and I don't think I really told you exactly how much I was struggling and how much my faith was on the line. I said, what would it look like if you were to argue me into becoming a Christian? Let's say I'm struggling with all this stuff. What would you tell me? Mm-hmm. And at that point, you gave me an awesome answer. You chose to, it was kind of like I got evangelized with some good news.
So I'm the Karaite Jew, and I am sharing the gospel with you essentially, and look from my background. I was raised studying the Talmud, and the Talmud is a very complex and complicated book, and everything in the Talmud is debates, but it's really not debates in the Western sense. It's more dialectic. A debate is we're arguing and I'm trying to win the debate. A dialectic is you're searching for the truth, and so you argue both sides of an argument to try to figure out what's true here, and with an open mind. And I try to approach everything that way. And so when you ask me, what are your proofs? If you had to prove to me that the New Testament is true, or that Jesus is the Messiah, Yeshua is the Messiah, so then I put on my Talmudic hat and I say, okay, I could argue against this all day long. The 7 reasons the Jews deny, I could give you all that stuff, right? But that's not what you were asking me. What you were asking me is, if you had to argue from the New Testament Yeshua side, what would the argument be? And if I'm going to be intellectually honest, I can give you that answer. And you're telling me that's what I did at the time, and I remember that conversation. I remember it on the couch. You remember it on the dinner table, but it was 5 years ago.
My conviction is it started on the couch and it went for hours, and it moved to the dinner table.
Makes sense to me.
Now, let me tell you what I thought you might come up with. You'd say, Mark, tell me about your lineage, and I'd say, well, Nehemia, my mother's family is Jewish, and you'd say, oh, well, tappy tap tap, and you'd get on your computer and you'd produce a little card that says you're now a Karaite, and then I would convert it.
Is your mother's lineage Jewish?
Yeah, she really is.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. I didn't remember that. All right.
But that isn't what happened. Instead, you explained to me how, from a linguistic point of view, when a New Testament author might say, as was prophesied, and then it names something that, maybe initially had nothing to do with the prophecy that they're pointing out, that was an acceptable linguistic tool. So tell us about that.
And I would call it more an interpretive tool.
Yes.
There's a linguistic aspect here. So, and I did a podcast about this that I'll refer people to. It was with AJ Bernard, and it was called, and because he asked me a very similar question. And he's a Methodist pastor, and I thought this is a great opportunity to share this with people rather than just the 45-minute answer I gave him. Let's share it. And so we had this conversation. We repeated the conversation on the podcast, and so there's this concept which I may have at the time called drosh, but it's a specific type of drosh called pesher. And pesher is, you find this term in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, and really this ties in perfectly with what we're told in Luke 24. In Luke 24, you have this scene where the people are walking on the road to Emmaus, and it's very guys, go read the story for yourselves. It fits perfectly with the pesher concept, because what it shows is that the disciples of Yeshua were not aware of the later interpretation of the 350 or so Messianic prophecies. They didn't understand those prophecies the way they're obvious today to Christian missionaries. And how do we know that? Because it says that they didn't, they said, this is a disaster. I'm paraphrasing, right? They thought it was a complete disaster walking on the road to Emmaus, that Yeshua had been killed and was 3 days in the grave, and now the tomb was empty. Why weren't they shouting for joy the tomb is empty? Because they didn't have this understanding at that time until he explained it to them. And what you take away, what I read in the Luke 24 account, is that you can have these understandings if that's what's revealed to you. And meaning these aren't what we would call pshat. They're not immediately obvious when you read them in the context, and they shouldn't be treated as such. So, for example, Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, I called my son out of Egypt. Well, the second half of the verse and the 2 verses later, it's talking about how my son committed idolatry. Well, that's not talking about Yeshua in the context, meaning the pshat, which is the plain meaning based in the language and the context is, it's talking about Israel, who was taken out of Egypt, in the desert worshiped the golden calf, and then in Israel worshiped other idols. That's the contextual meaning. But what they do in this pesher method that was used in the Second Temple times, you find it in the Dead Sea Scrolls and in rabbinical literature and in Karaite literature. So Jews used this for over 1,000 years. You find they say, okay, well, we know that God wouldn't do something so momentous as the destruction of the temple without it being mentioned in the Bible. The Second Temple, I mean. So then they go find a verse that describes the first temple, and they say, this foretold the destruction of the Second Temple. And you say, wait, in the context, it doesn't say that. We know it doesn't say that in the context. We're not idiots. But we have this statement in the prophets that God doesn't do something without revealing it to his servants, the prophets. So now we're looking at it from a pesher perspective. Now, the thing with the pesher perspective is that by and large, you first need to know what the outcome is. In other words, you need to know the temple was destroyed by the Romans, and there's no way God destroys his own temple without telling that to his servants, the prophets. And in the case of Luke 24, Yeshua, based on what Luke describes him as, he knows who he is, foretold in those prophecies, and he then reveals that to the people walking on the road to Emmaus. And it says there, he explained to them all the things concerning him in the law and the prophets. So look, those things haven't been revealed to me, but I can understand how, from a pesher perspective, you read those things and come to those conclusions. And I think Christian missionaries do themselves a disservice when they say, we have 300 in prophecies, and just look, who else could they be talking about? They have to be talking about Yeshua. And they're missing a component there. The component is, first you have to have the faith in Yeshua, and maybe it has to be revealed to you, and then you can see how these things then confirm that. Whereas if you're coming from my perspective, I didn't grow up with the faith in Yeshua. That's never been revealed to me. I read those and I say, well, I'm looking at these I understand the pesher perspective, but that wasn't revealed to me. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And what I found was that was very helpful, because some of these prophecies do appear to be, in fact, things with which I'm comfortable saying that was a prophecy and it was fulfilled in an amazing way. Yeah. But some of these pesher passages were very troublesome. And when I would talk to other theologians, I would realize they've never, ever really bothered to address the Tanakh passage. And they've not struggled with this. We just read it in books. We reprinted in other books, and other people quote other people who are quoting other people. And there was a lot of ignorance, and it caused me issues. I did go on to study more, and I found that we would be told that this is not an actual quotation from the Hebrew, or this is closer to the Septuagint, or it's somewhere in between, and we don't know exactly where this translation is, but it's not real close to the original. Ultimately found out there were a lot of Aramaic targums of the time. And for the common folks, they didn't have a copy. They didn't have a scroll of scripture, and they would write out some little paraphrases. And sometimes those might be the ones that were being quoted. And that's why the verbiage differed. I found out that, we've all kind of done some reconstruction of history. If I were to ask any pastor, why is Christmas celebrated on December 25th? He wouldn't tell me about pagan sun gods. He's got a new story, and that's the one that he's been told, and that's the one he passes on and he believes. And I found that some of that was happening. Modern day Christian liberal theologians and rabbis were passing on stories that said things like, oh, this passage was never considered messianic. Mm-hmm. Well, you go back and you find out that sometimes as many as 456 messianic passages were believed to be messianic at the time that aren't anymore, that they don't really quite to admit were. And in fact, and sometimes in those targums, they would actually get really loose with the translation and just put it in the word Messiah.
Yeah. Well, so the targum is paraphrastic. That's the term scholars use. It's a paraphrase.
Right.
And Aramaic in particular tends to be especially on the prophets. So I'll just give you an example. Isaiah 53. The counter missionaries will tell you it was never interpreted as a messianic prophecy. You open up the Aramaic Targum and you see the word Mashiach, which is Messiah. However, so then you ask the question, so why didn't the disciples of Yeshua walking on the road to Emmaus know, hey, we knew you were supposed to die and rise on the third day. You actually mentioned that in Galilee, and we know it from the Targum. How come they didn't say that? Because if you read the Targum in context, here's context important again, they interpreted Isaiah 53 in the Targum as a Messiah, but it was a conquering Messiah. And so it's really interesting. They use the word Messiah, Mashiach, an individual who's going to fulfill that role, but it's someone who's winning a battle. And it talks there about this, the part that the New Testament interprets and Christians interpret as referring to the suffering, the stripes that Yeshua received and those things. So that actually talks in the Targum. If I remember correctly, it's describing the Gentile nations who've come to war against Israel. They're the ones who are going to be stricken, right? So they had some of this broader understanding that this is messianic, but they didn't understand it in the way that it was explained to them according to Luke 24 on the road to Emmaus. Now, you said something to me yesterday that made me said, I need to share this with people. You said something to the effect of you gave me the ability to continue to believe. So talk about that.
I don't know that I could phrase it better than that. My faith was in a place of crisis. I was reading folks who told me that there was never a legitimate reason to believe that any of those references could have had anything to do with Messiah. And your love of the truth and your understanding of ancient texts and that tool of that pesher allowed me to realize the people who wrote the Brit Hadashah weren't idiots. They knew what they believed. They understood Hebrew. They understood Aramaic. They understood those devices. And it wasn't an attempt to hoodwink people 2,000 years later. Mm-hmm. And so I can deal with that text honestly, and I can allow Yehovah himself to guide me through all that. But what you allowed me to look past was ultimately, I think, spurious attacks on the validity of that type of linguistic tool.
And do you believe in Yeshua today?
I do, absolutely. But you believe that Yeshua existed. That was another fun conversation we had. Was I had a friend at the time who had gotten on some websites and completely believed that no man by that name existed in the first century, which is ludicrous. Right. We know that historically this was an event, and I have just loved in your ministry the way you pursue truth, you share knowledge, and part of your understanding of ancient documents and ancient languages allowed me to realize that those New Testament documents were not setting out to fool us, to hoodwink us. They were a legitimate way of conversing with those Tanakh texts. Nehemia, probably to summarize the whole event, you made it so that I could still believe in Yeshua.
Wow.